This is part one of a 5-part series where I talk about a project happening in higher education called Indigenising the Curriculum and how psychology in Australia is responding to that. And I'm going to argue that it's not responding too well. Why I'm negative about positive
Back to the story, because I've got a story.
So I've got some top tips on
It
writing.
helps you to think critically.
It helps people like me stop doing stupid things.
So this Indigenising the Curriculum project is not just happening in Australia, not just happening in psychology, but I want to talk about Australian psychology because I'm in Australia and I teach psychology. And this series is based on a chapter I've written for a book being edited by Craig Nunes called Racism and the Psychology Industry, which should be published in around late 2020. I'm going to tell you why psychology has been quite a bit racist in the past, and that the Indigenising the Curriculum project suggests it might be carrying on being quite a bit racist in the present, unless we do something about it. And don't worry, if you haven't heard of the Indigenising the Curriculum project, I'm going to tell you all about that in part 2 of this series. Before I get started, I've got a 5-minute animation to play for you, and I explain the ideas contained in that in part 2 of this series, but I'm showing it now as a way to draw you into the issues that I'm going to be discussing. At the end of the animation, I show an interview between John Peterson, a well-known Canadian psychologist, and Stefan Molyneux, who's a Canadian podcaster who's known for promoting race science. And I'll tell you about race science after the animation. So here's my animation. It's a bit shaky in places. I'm no Pixar, but I'm giving it my best shot.
IQ literature reveals that which no one would want to be the case, which is that there are profound and virtually irremediable differences in people's cognitive performance, and that those differences have a very solid biological and heritable basis. No one wants to hear that.
One of the things I have to tell you about IQ research is that if you don't buy IQ research, you might as well throw away all the rest of psychology.
They don't want to hear that it's biological. They don't want to hear that it's heritable. They don't want to hear it's permanent. They don't want to hear that it's irremediable and that it actually has a practical consequence. And no wonder they don't want to hear it.
They don't want to hear that it differs between genders and ethnicities. That is, to me, one of the most painful things that I've ever learned in my life. It is one of the great heartbreaks when it comes to the dream of pure egalitarianism, and that is, I think, even harder. It's an even harder pill for people to swallow.
Okay, so that video ended on the topic of race and IQ, what's known as race science. I'll get to that stuff at the start on the animation on how the British colonised Australia. I'll talk about that in part 2, but I need to begin by saying something about race science. So race science is essentially promoted by psychologists like Jordan Peterson, and it seeks that race science seeks to convince us that the reason black people are poor is because they're stupid. Now, race science has been completely debunked. It continues largely because the assumption it rests on, which is that intelligence is genetic, is imagined by the public to be true, even though it's not true. Now, I've been teaching psychology since the early 1990s, and whenever I tell psychology students that there's no link between genetics and IQ, the most common reaction I get from students is the question, but how about the twin studies? The twin studies?
Twins. We're basically the same.
No, they're not referring to that cracking comedy starring Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. No, they're talking about studies of twins who were separated at birth, raised in separate families, but found to have very similar IQs. You know, the conclusion from that must be that their IQ must be determined by their genes rather than by their upbringing. My instant reply is, well, that research is wrong. What's surprising is that psychology students either haven't been taught that the twin studies are wrong, or that they've been taught it but have forgotten it. Why are the twin studies wrong? Well, aside from those conducted by Cyril Burt, the guy who falsified all of his data, naughty old Cyril, the rest of it is just bad research because it failed to factor in important environmental variables. The biggest one of those variables was the fact that most of those twins separated at birth ended up getting adopted in similar type families. Adoption agencies, when separating twins, which was a rare thing, hardly ever happens nowadays, what they did was they tended to be really careful to choose similar families for both twins. The twins were processed together by an adoption agency, and under that agency's policy, those twins tended to end up in similar adoption families. So, say, for example, white middle-class families. It's kind of what you would expect. They would send the twins to similar families. So, as such, those twins, separated at birth, would largely get similar upbringings in terms of family life and, importantly, have the same sort of access to education. As such, it's unsurprising that those twins score similarly later on in life on IQ tests. You know, it's not to do with their genes, it's to do with their upbringing. Now, it's true that sometimes twins would be sent to different types of families just because there were not enough families able to adopt, but that was even rarer. That was an even rarer event. But let's think about what happens there. First, we need to look at those studies separately rather than pool them all in with the data we have on twins sent to similar families, because otherwise those small number of studies on twins who are sent to different types of families will just get masked by the data from all of the other twin studies. So we need to look at them separately. So in these instances, one twin goes to, say, a middle-class family with great access to education and parents that are educated at university level, and one twin goes to a working-class family with poor access to education and where the parents never went to university. Do you know what we find when we look at those cases? Large IQ differences between those twins. Look, there are so many reasons why it's implausible that there's a significant genetic component to intelligence that can explain IQ differences between individuals, let alone to explain differences between groups. And it's particularly improbable that genetics can explain IQ differences that have been observed between what are called racial groups, such as white people and black people. You know, this is the claim of race science, that there's a genetic reason why white people and black people differ in intelligence at a group level. One big problem here is that there is more genetic variance within a population of white people than there is between a population of white people and a population of black people. Geneticists tell us that race is not a biological or genetic concept. Now, talk more about that in another video on my channel, and I'll put the link to that in the description box below, and I'll also put a link to a useful newspaper article that sums up the problems with race IQ research and race science. What I'd like to do now is to consider the role psychology has played and is playing in the history of abuse suffered by Indigenous people. In the past, psychology essentially argued that Indigenous people had low levels of intelligence and that this was because of genetics, because of their genetic makeup. That psychological work was used to justify a whole range of violence, including mass killings, mass displacements, forced removal of Indigenous kids from their Indigenous parents, and so on. It has been horrific. But these days, the impression you get is that psychology has distanced itself from all of that, and apart from a few psychologists who promote race science like Jordan Peterson, we get by in psychology without having to pay too much attention to all of that stuff. And psychology generally doesn't promote that race science. But that doesn't mean that the rest of psychology in Australia is okay. I want to dig a bit deeper into psychology in Australia in my next videos and see why we still have problems in Australian psychology in relation to the way we treat Indigenous people. So, in part 2, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Indigenising the Curriculum project, a brief history of the colonisation of Australia, and talk about psychology's role in that, and also talk about some of the broader issues facing Indigenous people today. In part 3, I'm going to take a look at the Australian Psychological Society and tell you how they're trying to make amends for the past treatment of Indigenous people and how they're getting that wrong. In part 4, I'm going to tell you why I think they're getting it wrong, and in part 5, I'll tell you how psychology can do things better. So, I hope to see you in part 2. Till then, ta-da.